So I've been married for almost 6 years now, and for the most part, I'd say things have been pretty solid between me and my wife. We have a son together, or at least I thought we did, who's 6 years old. You know, the usual story. Met, fell in love, got married, had a kid. We have a nice house, good jobs, and from the outside looking in, everything probably seems perfect. But in the last year or so, things haven't been as smooth as they used to be. It's hard to explain, but there were these subtle moments, small things you could easily brush off, like we didn't talk as much as we used to, or there'd be these weird silences after I'd ask her about her day. Sometimes she'd get defensive over nothing, or when I'd ask about something related to our son like school or his friends, she'd answer, but there'd be a pause first. I guess I chalked it up to regular marriage stuff. Everyone goes through rough patches, right? Anyway, recently something happened that's thrown my entire world upside down. Our son, let's call him Jay for the sake of this story, got sick. At first we thought it was just a typical cold, but after a few days he wasn't getting any better. So we took him to the doctor. The usual tests were done, and they said it was probably just a virus. But as parents do, we worried, so we asked for more tests just to be safe. That's when things got weird. The doctor started asking about family medical history, whether there was any history of certain diseases on my side or my wife's. We went through the typical stuff, but the doctor seemed a little concerned. There was some question about genetic markers, something about treatments that work better with certain genetic backgrounds. Honestly, a lot of it went over my head at first, but my wife seemed more on edge than usual. At the time, I didn't think much of it, just figured it was her worrying about our son like I was. But then the doctor requested more tests. These weren't just your standard blood tests. They were digging into some deeper genetic stuff. I didn't ask too many questions, trusting that they knew what they were doing. But after a few more appointments, the doctor pulled me aside and told me that some of the genetic markers they were looking for weren't adding up with my side of the family. I didn't know what that meant, so I asked for clarification. The doctor, trying to be as gentle as possible, explained that Jay's genetic profile didn't seem to match mine at all. And that's when it hit me. Something was wrong, really wrong. After the appointment, I confronted my wife. I didn't know how else to approach it, so I just asked her outright, "Is there something you're not telling me?" I expected her to get defensive, to push back like she had in the past, but she didn't. She got quiet, real quiet. We went home, and later that night, after Jay had gone to bed, she sat me down. She said she needed to tell me something that she should have told me a long time ago. That's when she dropped the bomb. Jay isn't my biological son. I didn't know what to say. I think I just sat there, frozen, trying to process what I'd just heard. She told me that when we met, she had recently split up with her ex-husband. I knew about the ex. She'd told me they'd had a messy breakup, and I'd assumed that was the end of it. But apparently she'd been pregnant when they split, something she never mentioned. She told me she was scared, that when she found out she was pregnant, her ex-husband didn't want anything to do with the baby. He walked away, didn't want to be involved at all, and she didn't want to raise the child alone. So when we got together, she saw me as someone who could be a good father figure for her child. And when Jay was born, she let me believe he was mine. The more she talked, the more it felt like the ground was falling out from under me. I asked her why she never told me, why she let me believe that Jay was my son for all these years. She said she didn't want to lose me, that she thought I would have left her if I knew. And once we got married and settled into life, it just became easier to keep the secret. Now, I don't even know what to think. For 6 years, I've been raising this boy as my own, and I love him more than anything. But now, all of a sudden, I'm being told that he's not mine. My wife lied to me, and I'm stuck between feeling betrayed by her and worried about what this means for my relationship with Jay. I haven't told anyone yet. I don't even know how to bring it up. How do you explain something like this to your family, to your friends? How do I even begin to figure out what to do next? I don't want to hurt Jay, but at the same time, I feel like my entire life has been built on a lie. I thought about confronting her ex, but I haven't decided yet. Part of me just wants to pack up and leave, but how can I abandon the boy I've raised as my own, even if he's not biologically mine? It's all too much to process. So I guess I'm here writing this out because I don't know what else to do. What am I supposed to do now? I'm at a loss. After the bombshell that my wife dropped on me, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, things were tense. We didn't say much to each other, and I kept going through the motions, trying to be normal around Jay. But every time I looked at him, I felt this weight on my chest, like I was looking at a different kid, even though nothing had really changed for him. He's still the same boy I've raised for 6 years, but suddenly there's this new layer to everything. Later that day, after I dropped Jay off at school, I couldn't hold back anymore. I sat my wife down and asked her the questions that had been running through my mind all night. Why didn't you tell me sooner? What did you think was going to happen when the truth came out? I wasn't angry, not in the shouting kind of way, but there was a coldness in my voice that I could feel, and I think she felt it too. She told me she never meant for things to get this far, that when we first got together, she had just come out of a bad place with her ex. She explained that when they were married, everything seemed fine at first, but things changed when she got pregnant. Her ex wasn't ready to be a father, and From what she told me, he wanted nothing to do with the baby. He left her when she was still early in the pregnancy, and she was devastated. Then, she met me not long after, and things between us moved quickly. She said she saw a chance to start fresh, to have the family she always wanted, and she didn't want to lose that. As she talked, I could feel the tension rising. She kept saying how she thought her ex was gone for good, how she never expected him to come back, and how she thought it would be better for me to raise Jay as my own. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lied to from the start. I asked her why she didn't tell me once we got married, once Jay was born, or even after that. She just kept saying the same thing. She was scared. Scared that I would leave, scared that I wouldn't want to be a father to Jay if I knew he wasn't mine biologically. I didn't know what to do with that. I couldn't tell if she was being honest or just trying to make excuses. But either way, the damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no going back. I needed to figure out what to do next. The next few days were awkward. We didn't fight, but there was this unspoken tension between us. I spent a lot of time thinking about Jay and what this meant for him. I'd raised him since he was born, been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. How could I just walk away from that? But at the same time, I felt completely blindsided. My wife had kept something so huge from me, something that changed everything. I couldn't just pretend like it didn't matter. One night after Jay had gone to bed, I sat down and started doing some research. I wanted to know what my options were legally. I wasn't thinking about disowning Jay, not really, but I needed to understand what this meant for me, for him, and for our future. Was I still considered his legal father? Did the biological father, my wife's ex, have any rights to him? What would happen if he came back into the picture? I contacted a lawyer the next day to get some advice. I didn't tell my wife at first, not until I had a clearer understanding of what was going on. The lawyer explained that, legally speaking, things could get complicated. Even though I wasn't Jay's biological father, I'd been raising him as my own, so the courts might still consider me his legal guardian. But if the biological father decided to get involved, things could shift. That's when I started to worry even more. My wife had told me that her ex didn't want anything to do with Jay, but could that change? People do strange things when time passes. What if he decided to come back into the picture and wanted custody? The lawyer didn't have all the answers right away, but they did mention that biological parents often have certain rights, especially if they can prove that they didn't know about the child or weren't given a chance to be involved. I couldn't stop thinking about what that would mean. Could this guy, this man who walked out on my wife and her unborn child, suddenly come back and demand to be a part of Jay's life? And if he did, what would that mean for me? Would I just be pushed out? I finally talked to my wife about it. I told her I'd spoken to a lawyer, and I needed to know more about her ex. She wasn't happy that I'd gone behind her back, but at this point, I didn't really care. I needed answers. She told me again that her ex had made it clear he didn't want to be involved when she was pregnant, that he'd walked away without a second thought. But the way she hesitated when she talked about him made me wonder if there was more to the story. I pushed her a little harder, asking if she'd had any contact with him since then. She admitted that they'd had some brief communication a few years ago, but it was nothing serious, just some messages back and forth that set off alarm bells for me. If they'd been in contact, even if it was just messages, there was a chance he knew more about Jay than I thought. Maybe he was already thinking about coming back. I pressed her again, asking if she thought he might try to claim any rights to Jay now that the truth was out. She didn't have an answer. That was the scariest part. Neither of us knew what was coming next. I went back to the lawyer and asked what would happen if the ex decided to pursue custody. They told me that it wasn't a clear-cut situation. If the biological father could prove that he was fit and willing to take on the role of father, there might be a legal battle ahead. I wasn't ready for that. I didn't know if I had it in me to fight for Jay in court, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing him. As I sat there, the lawyer gave me one final piece of information. There was a real possibility that the ex-husband could have a legitimate claim over Jay if he decided to push for it. Now, I'm left wondering if I'm about to lose the child I've raised for 6 years, and I don't even know where to begin. A few weeks passed after that conversation with the lawyer, and things were still tense at home. My wife and I barely talked unless it was necessary, and I felt like I was walking on eggshells around her. It wasn't the kind of silence where things were calming down, though. It was the kind that made you feel like something big was coming. And then, something big did come. Out of nowhere, my wife told me her ex-husband had contacted her. She was nervous when she told me, almost like she didn't want to say the words out loud. He had reached out, wanting to see Jay. According to her, he said he had changed and now wanted to be part of the boy's life. That hit me like a ton of bricks. This man, who had walked away and left her to raise a child on her own, now wanted to come back and act like nothing had happened. I didn't say anything at first, just listened while she tried to explain what had happened. She showed me a message from him where he talked about how much he regretted his past mistakes and how he was a different person now. He even mentioned that he had a better job, a more stable life, and wanted to do right by Jay. I wasn't buying it. It felt like a slap in the face. For 6 years, I had been there for Jay, while this guy was nowhere to be found. And now suddenly he thinks he can just walk back in and take over? It didn't sit right with me, but I knew I needed to stay calm and think this through. The next few days were rough. My wife was clearly torn, trying to figure out what to do. She didn't want to push me away, but at the same time, she was stuck between the father of her child and the man who had been raising him. I knew that Jay didn't have a clue about any of this. To him, I was his dad, and that's all that mattered. But now, There was this looming threat that his whole world was about to be turned upside down. After a lot of back and forth, I decided that I needed to meet the ex-husband. I didn't want to, but I figured it was better to get a sense of what kind of person he was now, instead of waiting for him to force his way into our lives. My wife arranged for us to meet at a coffee shop, neutral ground where things could stay as civil as possible. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately. He was sitting there, looking casual, like this was just another day for him. It was strange. He didn't look like the type of guy who would abandon his family. But then again, what does that even look like? I sat down and we exchanged pleasantries, though the air was thick with tension. Right away, he started talking about how much he had changed, how he regretted walking away from my wife when she needed him most. He mentioned that he had a steady job now, a house, and that he was in a good place financially. It all sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing what to say. He kept using phrases like, "I just want to do what's right for Jay, and I'm ready to step up and be a father now." But as the conversation went on, it became clear that he wasn't just here to apologize or reconnect. He was testing the waters, hinting at the possibility of getting custody or at least shared custody. He mentioned how stable his life was now, how he could offer Jay things that maybe I couldn't. I could feel my anger rising, but I kept it in check. I didn't want to give him any reason to think I wasn't in control of the situation. The conversation didn't last long, but it was enough for me to see what was really going on. He wasn't just here to make amends, he wanted to be part of Jay's life, and he wasn't going to go away quietly. I walked out of that meeting feeling like things were about to get a whole lot worse. A few days later, I got a call from my lawyer. They'd been looking into the situation more, trying to figure out what kind of legal ground the ex-husband might have if he decided to push for custody. That's when they hit me with some alarming news. It wasn't as clear-cut as I'd hoped. If the ex-husband could prove that he was fit to take on the role of father, and that he had made an effort to be part of Jay's life even if it was late, the courts might take him seriously. This wasn't just a hypothetical either. The lawyer told me that given the fact that the ex-husband was now reaching out and expressing a desire to be involved, there was a real chance that he could try to claim some form of custody. It didn't matter that he'd been absent for the first 6 years of Jay's life. What mattered was what he did from this point forward. Hearing that was like a punch to the gut. I thought that after everything I'd done for Jay, there was no way anyone could come in and take him away from me. But now, there was a real possibility that I could lose him, or at least lose part of the relationship we had. My mind started racing, thinking about what this would mean for Jay. How would he react if he found out the truth? What would it do to him if this man, who he doesn't even know, suddenly became a part of his life? I hung up the phone, feeling more lost than ever. This situation had gone from bad to worse in a matter of weeks. First, the revelation that Jay wasn't biologically mine, and now this, the threat of losing him to a man who had abandoned him before he was even born. The worst part is, I don't know what to do next. The ex-husband seems determined, and I'm worried that this is just the beginning of a long and painful battle for custody. My wife is still trying to figure out where she stands in all of this, but I can see the guilt on her face every time we talk about it. She knows she's the one who opened this door, and now, none of us can close it. The only thing I know for sure is that I'm not giving up on Jay, but I can't shake the feeling that this is far from over. After the meeting with the ex-husband and the alarming call from my lawyer, things went downhill fast. My wife and I could hardly talk without the conversation circling back to Jay and the situation we found ourselves in. She seemed desperate for things to return to some version of normal, but I knew that wasn't possible anymore. The truth was out, and there was no going back. One evening, after putting Jay to bed, my wife sat me down and begged me to continue raising him as I had been. She argued that the ex-husband was just trying to stir up trouble, that he had always been that way. She said he didn't really care about Jay, he only cared about causing chaos in our lives. She insisted that I was Jay's real father, the one who had been there for him every single day, and that no one else could replace that. While I listened, it was hard to shake the feeling that this was all her doing. She was the one who had kept this secret from me for 6 years. And now, after everything was out in the open, she expected me to just go along with it and pretend nothing had changed. I wasn't sure if I could do that anymore. Trusting her had been the foundation of our relationship, and that foundation was now cracked. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I started looking into her ex-husband's past. I needed to know what kind of person we were dealing with before making any decisions. A few late nights and a lot of digging revealed some things I hadn't expected. From what I found, the ex-husband had a history of shady business dealings, some of which involved financial scams that got him into trouble a few years ago. It seemed like his life wasn't as stable as he made it out to be during our meeting, but that wasn't all. There were rumors, nothing I could prove, that he had been involved with some questionable people in the past, which raised even more red flags. It didn't sit right with me. The idea that this man, who had already walked out on his own child once, might gain some kind of legal right over Jay made me feel sick. He wasn't the kind of person I wanted anywhere near my son. I was keeping this information to myself for now, not sure how or when to use it, but I knew it could become important if things escalated into a legal battle. At the same time, Jay had started to notice that something was wrong. He wasn't old enough to understand everything, but he was smart enough to pick up on the tension between me and my wife. He'd been asking more questions lately, questions that were getting harder to answer. Simple things like, why aren't you and mom talking as much, or is everything okay? Those questions hit me harder than I expected because I knew that eventually he'd want to know more. And when that time came, what was I supposed to tell him? As the days passed, I could feel the weight of everything building up. My wife was pushing hard for me to stay in the role of Jay's father, and I didn't want to let him go. But every time I looked at him, the reality of the situation gnawed at me. The ex-husband was out there, lurking like a shadow over our lives, and I couldn't help but feel like this was all a ticking time bomb. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail. I knew what it was before I even opened it. It was from the ex-husband's lawyer. Inside, there was a formal request for shared custody. He was making his move. I stared at the paper for what felt like hours. There it was, in black and white, a legal demand for a relationship with the boy I had raised since birth. It didn't matter that he had been absent for 6 years, or that he had only just resurfaced. Now, with this document, he was claiming his rights as the biological father, and the courts might listen. I felt like I was being backed into a corner. My wife was adamant that I should fight for full custody, that we should do everything in our power to keep Jay away from her ex-husband. She pleaded with me not to give in, not to let this man come into Jay's life and disrupt everything we had built. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could trust her anymore. She had lied to me for years, and now she wanted me to fight a battle that I wasn't even sure I could win. The letter from the lawyer made everything real. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future. A future where Jay might have to split his time between me and the man who had abandoned him before he was even born. I thought about what that would do to him, how confusing and hurtful it would be. He didn't even know this man existed, and now he was being thrust into the middle of a legal fight between two people who both claimed to be his father. I reached out to my lawyer immediately after reading the letter. They told me this was just the beginning. The ex-husband was trying to establish his claim, and if he could prove that he was a fit parent, there was a chance the courts would grant him some form of custody, even though he had been absent all these years. It was all about what was considered in the best interest of the child, and the courts might think that having both biological parents involved was the best thing for Jay. I didn't know what to do. The idea of fighting for full custody seemed like a mountain I wasn't sure I could climb, but at the same time, walking away felt impossible. I had been Jay's dad for his entire life. He was my son in every way that mattered, except one. And that one thing, biology, was threatening to tear our family apart. The next few days were a blur. My wife kept pushing me to stay in the fight, to keep being the father Jay needed. She said she believed we could win, that we could prove the ex-husband wasn't fit to be in Jay's life. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the guilt that she had brought us to this point. And no matter what she said, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. With the custody battle looming, I had to make a choice. Do I fight for full custody, knowing that it would be a long, brutal process that could tear our family apart? Or do I step back, let things play out, and hope that Jay can somehow come out of this unscathed? The letter from the lawyer was still sitting on the kitchen table, a constant reminder that the clock was ticking, and I still didn't have any answers. The courtroom was nothing like I'd imagined. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. I was sitting there, my hands gripping the edge of the table in front of me, listening as my lawyer laid out our case. Across from me, the ex-husband sat with his lawyer, calm and confident, like he already knew how things were going to play out. I had decided to fight for Jay. There was no other choice. I wasn't going to let this man, who had abandoned him before he was born, come back and tear apart everything we had built. But I knew it wasn't going to be easy. The legal battle was tough from the start. Both sides were presenting their arguments, and the judge listened to everything with that same unreadable expression, making it impossible to tell which way the case was leaning. My lawyer focused on the fact that I had been the one raising Jay for 6 years, that I had been the only father he had ever known. We provided evidence showing that the ex-husband had walked away when my wife was pregnant, and that he had been absent for all those crucial early years. I hoped that would be enough, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The ex-husband's lawyer countered with his own narrative. He painted a picture of a man who had made mistakes but had now turned his life around. He argued that the ex-husband was ready and willing to be a father, that he had the right to be part of Jay's life now that he was stable. He had a good job, a house, and a support system. The lawyer pushed hard on the idea that biology mattered, that Jay had the right to know his real father. Every time the ex-husband's lawyer spoke, it felt like we were losing ground. I looked over at my wife, who sat beside me, and I could see the stress etched on her face. We were on the same side, but things between us hadn't been the same since all of this started. There were too many secrets, too many lies, and now it felt like the cracks were starting to show. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, something unexpected happened. A woman entered the courtroom, someone I hadn't seen in years. It was one of my wife's old friends, someone she had lost contact with a long time ago. I didn't know why she was there until she took the stand as a witness. Her testimony changed everything. She had known my wife and the ex-husband back when they were still together. What she revealed in court was shocking. Apparently, the ex-husband hadn't just walked away when my wife got pregnant. He had threatened her. According to her friend, he had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with the child, and worse, he had pressured my wife to have an abortion. When she refused, he cut all ties and disappeared. The friend also testified that he had been involved in some pretty shady behavior during that time, including some violent incidents that had never been reported. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke. The ex-husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught off guard by this new information. His lawyer tried to downplay the testimony, but the damage was done. The judge was paying attention now, and for the first time since the trial began, I felt like things were starting to turn in my favor. That testimony painted a much darker picture of the ex-husband than he had tried to present. It wasn't just about him being absent or making mistakes. It was about him being a potential danger to Jay. The judge took all of this into consideration as the case continued, and I could see the tide turning. But even as things were looking up for me in the courtroom, my relationship with my wife was unraveling outside of it. We were on the same side legally, but emotionally we were miles apart. The trust that had been broken when she kept Jay's true parentage a secret was hard to rebuild. Every time we talked, it felt like there was something unspoken between us, resentment, guilt, anger. It was all there, simmering beneath the surface. I started to wonder if this legal fight was going to destroy us, no matter the outcome. The court hearings dragged on for what felt like an eternity, with both sides presenting more evidence and testimony. But after that bombshell from my wife's friend, things started to move faster. The judge eventually ruled in my favor. I would retain full custody of Jay, and the ex-husband's request for shared custody was denied. For a brief moment, I felt relief. I had won. I wasn't going to lose Jay. But that relief was short-lived. As soon as the ruling was made, the ex-husband's lawyer stood up and announced that they were planning to appeal the decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They were going to fight this, and now it looked like we were headed for another round in court. I left the courtroom that day with mixed emotions. On one hand, I had won the first battle, but the war wasn't over. And on the other hand, my marriage felt like it was hanging by a thread. Every conversation with my wife was tense, filled with unresolved issues from the past that we hadn't dealt with. We had been so focused on the court case that we hadn't stopped to think about what this was doing to us as a couple. The ex-husband's lawyer made it clear that they weren't giving up. The appeal process could take months, maybe even longer, and I wasn't sure if I had the energy to keep fighting. But I knew I couldn't back down, not when Jay's future was at stake. As we left the courthouse, my wife reached out to take my hand, but I pulled away. I didn't mean to, but it just happened. That moment seemed to sum up everything that was going on between us. We were together, but barely. And now, with the appeal looming, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer this fight would go on and whether our marriage would survive it. The weeks following the court ruling were some of the most exhausting of my life. Even though I had won the initial case, knowing that an appeal was on the horizon kept me on edge. I tried to stay focused on Jay, on making sure things were as normal as possible for him. But deep down, I knew there was a storm brewing. Every conversation with my wife felt like we were just tiptoeing around the real issues, and I had no idea how much longer we could keep doing that. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. One morning, I got a call from my lawyer. They sounded surprised and almost relieved. The ex-husband had dropped the appeal. I didn't believe it at first. It felt too sudden, too easy. After all the fighting, all the tension, why would he suddenly back down? But it turned out that something had happened that made continuing the custody battle impossible for him. Apparently, he had gotten involved in some kind of personal scandal, something bad enough to damage his reputation and make him think twice about pursuing custody. I never got all the details, and honestly, I didn't care. What mattered to me was that the legal battle was over. The ex-husband was out of the picture for good. I didn't have to worry about losing Jay anymore. But even with that weight lifted, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. With the court case behind us, it was time to confront the reality of my marriage. The months of lies, the court battles, the secrets, it had taken its toll on us, and it was something we couldn't ignore any longer. We sat down one evening, after Jay had gone to sleep, and I finally said what I had been holding in for too long. I couldn't stay in the marriage. I had spent so much time trying to hold everything together for Jay's sake, but the truth was, the trust between my wife and I had been broken beyond repair. It wasn't just about her hiding the fact that Jay wasn't biologically mine. It was about the years of living in a lie, the court battle that had dragged us through the mud, and the constant tension that had built up between us. My wife didn't argue. She looked devastated, of course, but I think deep down she knew it too. We couldn't go back to the way things were before. Too much had happened. We were both exhausted, and while we were still committed to Jay, we weren't the same people we had been when we first got married. We talked about what would happen next. The one thing we both agreed on was that Jay had to come first. No matter what had happened between us, he deserved a stable and loving environment. So we worked out a co-parenting arrangement. We wouldn't be living together anymore, but we made sure that Jay would have as much consistency as possible. We decided to stay close by each other so that he could spend time with both of us without too much disruption. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was the best we could do. Breaking the news to Jay was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. We didn't give him all the details. He was still too young to understand the full story. But we explained that things were going to change, that his mom and I wouldn't be living together anymore, but that we both loved him very much and that we would still be a family, even if we weren't in the same house. He cried, of course, and that broke my heart. But over the next few days, he started to adjust, and we made sure to keep things as steady as possible for him. As for me and my wife, the separation was hard at first, but it felt like the right decision. Without the constant tension between us, we were actually able to focus more on Jay and what was best for him. We were no longer trying to force something that wasn't working, and that allowed us to be better co-parents. We even found a way to communicate civilly, though I don't think we'll ever be close again. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time. Just months ago, I thought I might lose Jay, that some stranger could come in and take over the role I had played for 6 years. But now, here I am, still in his life, still his father, even though so much has fallen apart around us. I've learned a lot from this whole experience. Family isn't just about biology, it's about the choices you make, the love you give, and the responsibility you take on. I chose to be Jay's father, and nothing can change that. He may not be my biological son, but in every way that matters, he's mine, and I'll keep fighting for him no matter what. As for my marriage, I've come to terms with the fact that it's over. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but I've realized that some things can't be fixed. The lies, the betrayal, they were too much to come back from. But I don't regret the time I spent with my wife. We had good years, and together we raised an amazing boy. I just wish things had played out differently. Now, it's about moving forward. I'm focused on being the best father I can be for Jay, even if I'm doing it on my own. I've started to rebuild my life, and while it's not easy, I'm slowly finding my way. I hope that by sharing my story, it can help someone else who might be going through something similar. Life throws all kinds of unexpected challenges at us, and sometimes the things we thought were solid crumble beneath us. But family, real family, is about more than just blood. It's about who's there for you, who shows up when it matters, and who sticks around through the tough times. In the end, I may have lost my marriage, but I didn't lose my son, and that's what matters most.